Welcome to the Missouri First Steps Early Intervention webinar on progress notes and record-keeping requirements. This webinar is a review of the requirements for First Steps providers to maintain progress notes and record-keeping activities. The information for this presentation is an overview of the guidance in the First Steps Service Provider Manual, Chapter 7, for progress notes and record keeping. The key topics reviewed today include requirements for a therapy log, requirements for progress notes, and various record keeping activities. The Service Provider Manual, Chapter 7, is available online on the Office of Childhood's website under Early Intervention, First Steps, Providers, Service Provider Manual. Providers who successfully enroll in the First Steps program are required to complete and sign the Missouri First Steps Service Provider Agreement. According to this agreement, providers are required to maintain 2 records for First Step services. The first type of required documentation is a time and effort therapy log that records services delivered to the child and family. The second type of required documentation is an electronic progress note in the First Step system, otherwise known as WebSPOE, and according to DESE requirements. The following information will provide a description and a sample of a therapy log and a progress note. The first type of required documentation is a therapy log. A therapy log is a chart, timesheet, or summary table used to record the details of a delivered service in First Steps. All enrolled providers in First Steps are required to maintain a therapy log with the exception of these 2, assistive technology device providers and parent or provider agency transportation providers. A therapy log is required for the following First Steps services: evaluation and assessment, direct child service, consultation with others, family education and training, group services, or teletherapy. However, a therapy log is not required for the following: Individualized Family Service Plan or IFSP meetings, and Early Intervention Team or EIT meetings. This is because the service coordinator is responsible for the attendance records at these meetings. Therefore, the meetings are not required to be included in a therapy log. A therapy log must be completed prior to submitting a claim for payment. Best practice is to complete a therapy log immediately after each service is delivered. There are 3 options for keeping a therapy log for First Steps. 1, a paper copy may be kept at the provider's location. 2, an electronic copy may be kept at the provider's location. Or 3, an electronic copy can be kept in WebSPOE. Regardless of where a therapy log is kept, the content of the therapy log must include the following: the child's name and date of birth, the date of service, the setting for the service type, the length of a visit, that is the time in and the time out, and the provider's signature. The person who's responsible for maintaining the therapy log is the provider who's delivering the service, otherwise known as the performing provider. This is an example of a therapy log kept on paper in the provider's location. In this example, the provider is organizing the log according to the child's name. This means the provider keeps a log for each child individually. On the screen, you can see the following required components for a therapy log. There is the child's name, the child's date of birth. The first column is the date of service. The second column is the service type and the service setting. The next 2 columns are the time in and the time out. And finally, at the end of the log is the provider's signature. In this example, the provider keeps therapy logs on paper, and the signature is an original signature. One option that the provider added to the requirements is the number of units in the last column. The provider records 4 units to keep track of the amount of time for billing. This is another example of a therapy log. In this example, the therapy log is kept electronically at the provider's location. For this example, the provider is organizing the log according to the dates of service. This means the provider keeps 1 log for a certain period of time, such as a weekly log or a monthly log. The log includes every service delivered by the provider. On the screen, you can see the following required components of a therapy log. The first column is the date of service. The second column is the child's name and the child's date of birth. The third column is the service type and the service setting. And the last column are the time in and time out of each date of service. At the bottom of the page is the provider's signature. In this example, the provider keeps therapy logs in an electronic system that is not WebSPOE. Therefore, the signature is entered by the provider and stated on the copy as electronic signed by the provider and the discipline. Our final example of a therapy log is one of the pages in WebSPOE for entering a daily therapy log. At the top of the page, you will see the provider's name, the provider specialty, and the entry date. All three of these pre-populated based on the provider who has logged into WebSPOE and the date of entry. Remember, only the performing provider can enter a daily therapy log in WebSPOE. This is why the provider name and specialty pre-populate. Next on the page is the date of service and the time in and time out and the service setting. The provider must enter this information based on the service delivered to the child and family. An important note here is the format of the date of service and the time in and the time out. You can see on the screen that the system displays the required format for these numbers. For the date of service, the date must be entered in the format of month, day, and 4-digit year. For the time in and time out, time must be entered in hours, minutes, and then AM or PM. The final required piece of data entry of the daily therapy log is the visit summary. This is a narrative of the activities conducted for the date of service listed above. The provider comments are optional in a daily therapy log. Once data entry is complete, a daily therapy log can be printed from WebSPOE. This is an example of a printed copy of a daily therapy log. Once printed, both the pre-populated information and the information entered by the performing provider display in the daily therapy log. Additionally, the remaining requirements for the child's name, the child's date of birth, and a statement for an electronic signature all print in the daily therapy log as shown on the screen. As a reminder, the visit summary is required. The provider enters information related to IFSP outcomes and activities conducted with the child and family on this date of service in this box. Provider comments are optional. The provider may enter family information or other information not related to IFSP outcomes in this box. The second type of required documentation is a progress note. A progress note is a record entered in WebSPOE that explains the activities the provider conducted or the discussions the provider had during the visit with the child and family throughout the particular month. The requirement for entering a progress note for First Step services depends on how the provider chooses to maintain his or her therapy log. Next, I'll review the requirements for a progress note. Remember, there are 3 options for keeping therapy logs for First Step services. Each provider must choose one of these options for therapy logs. If the provider chooses paper copy at the provider location, a monthly progress note is required in WebSPOE. If the provider chooses to keep therapy logs in electronic copy at the provider location, a monthly progress note is required in WebSPOE. However, if the provider chooses to keep therapy logs in electronic copy in WebSPOE, then a monthly progress note is not required. This means if the provider does not keep therapy logs in WebSPOE, then a progress note must be entered in WebSPOE no later than 30 days from the claim submission for payment. Best practice is to complete a progress note by the last day of each month in which services are delivered. A progress note is required for the following First Step services: direct child service, consultation with others, family education and training, group services, and teletherapy. A progress note is not required for the following: individualized family service plan or IFSP meeting, and early intervention team or EIT team meetings. This is because the service coordinator is responsible for attendance records at these meetings. Of note, providers are not required to have a progress note for an evaluation or an assessment. This is because documentation of the activity is the provider's written report. However, if the first visit with the family includes administering a test, then the provider must include the activities conducted during the visit in a monthly progress note. The provider may include a test results in the progress note, but this is not required. A progress note in WebSPOE must include the following information: the month and the date of service delivered to the child and family, any visits canceled or made up that month, and a summary of the child and family progress. The performing provider or the agency or billing administrator can enter a progress note in WebSPOE. This is an example of the page in WebSPOE for entering a monthly progress note. At the top of the page, you see the provider's name and the provider's specialty, a line for entered by, and an entry date. These items are the same in WebSPOE. The user enters the provider's name, and then the provider specialty will pre-populate. The entered by line and the entry date are already pre-populated based on the individual who is logging in and entering the progress note. Remember, either the performing provider or the agency or billing administrator can enter a monthly progress note in WebSPOE. This is why the provider name must be entered. It is possible for an agency or billing administrator to enter a note for the provider. Next on the page is the month and year. This represents the month and the year in which services were delivered by the provider. The individual entering the note selects the month and year from a drop-down box. Next on the page is the dates of service. The individual entering the note enters each date of service delivered in that month and year. Once a day appears in the line, select the Add button to ensure the date appears in the list. If no services were delivered in that month, a note can still be entered by checking the box for No Services Delivered. This allows a record of information for attempts to contact the family or cancellations that month. Next on the page is a selection for any visits canceled or made up in progress summaries. Both of these boxes are required. Information is entered according to the visits that occurred in that month. And finally, provider comments are optional in the monthly progress note. Once data entry is complete, a monthly progress note can be printed from WebSPOE. This is an example of a printed copy of a monthly progress note. Once printed, both the pre-populated information and the information entered by the user display in the monthly progress note. Additionally, the remaining requirements for the child's name and the child's date of birth also print in the monthly progress note as shown on the screen. You may notice at the bottom of the screen, there is no statement for electronically signed by the provider. This is because it's not required for a progress note entered in WebSPOE. As a reminder on the screen, the progress summary is required. The provider summarizes information related to the IFSP outcomes and activities conducted with the child and family this month in this box. Also, provider comments are optional. The provider can summarize family information that is not related to the IFSP outcomes in this box. A daily therapy log or a monthly progress note can be entered in WebSPOE when the child's record is active or when the child's record is inactive. When the child's record is active, the provider can access the home page in WebSPOE. Click on My EI Kids in the middle of the home page and then select child's name from the list. Once selecting a child's name from the list, inside the child's record, the provider clicks on the Services tab and then clicks on Progress Notes in the drop-down menu. Then there is a button to enter either a daily therapy log or a monthly progress note. If the child's record is inactive, there's a 90-day time frame related to accessing progress notes. If the child's record has been inactivated within 90 days, the provider can access entry of progress notes by going to the home page in WebSPOE. Then click on Progress Notes Due, select the child's record from the list. Once inside the child's record, you would also gain to the Service tab. Click on Progress Notes from the drop-down menu, and there you can enter a daily therapy log or monthly progress note. If 90 days or more has passed since the child's record was inactivated, the provider can still enter a progress note or a daily therapy log, but needs to go to a different location in WebSPOE. Once this time is passed, the provider would go to the Provider Account Management tab at the top of the WebSPOE system. Click on Authorization Search, then enter the child's name selected, the authorization from the list, and click on Authorization Detail, and then enter progress notes. Using these procedures for after 90 days, there is no timeline for entering a daily therapy log or a monthly progress note in a child's record that has been inactivated. At any time when entering a claim for payment for First Step services, a reminder to enter required documentation appears in WebSPOE. The reminder appears when the user accesses the Provider Account Management tab and then either selects the claim entry or selects Authorization Search, Enter Claim. The message says, reminder, a daily therapy log or monthly progress note is required for all delivered services prior to entering claims. The requirements for record keeping include the following. All clinical records maintained at the provider's location must be kept by the provider for at least 5 years. This includes any financial records such as therapy logs, progress notes, evaluation reports, or applicable medical or educational records such as the physician prescription, discharge summaries, or other physician records. Keep in mind, upon request, the provider must make available to DESE or its designee all records necessary to ensure the appropriate payments were made. Also, recall all First Step services are subject to federal, state, and local audits or a financial monitoring. For more information about activities related to audits and monitoring, please view Chapter 9 on Billing and Accountability in the First Step Service Provider Manual. This concludes our presentation for Missouri First Steps Early Intervention on progress notes and record keeping requirements. If you have additional questions about these requirements, please go to the First Steps website at the link shown on your page to access the complete Service Provider Manual Chapter 7 on progress notes and record keeping. If you have additional questions, you can email the Early Intervention section at the email address shown on your screen, or you can call the Early Intervention section, and we would be happy to address any questions that you have. Thank you for participating in today's presentation.